Hi, everyone. Welcome to Illustration and its Histories, New Resources, New Voices, New Directions, a symposium organized by the Rockwell Center for American Visual Studies at the Norman Rockwell Museum and the Hunter College Department of Art and Art History. My name is Stephanie Plunkett. I'm Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the Norman Rockwell Museum, and it's a great pleasure to have you all with us today. Your participation is truly a bright spot in what we can probably all agree has been a challenging and unprecedented time. When Mike Lobel and I began working on this project several months ago, we, like all of you, had no idea what was in store. Michael and Howard Singerman, chair of the Department of Art and Art History at Hunter College, generously agreed to partner with us to organize and present a symposium in a comfortable space at the college on East 69th Street between Park and Lexington Avenues in New York City. With wonderful amenities, the conference room would have accommodated a little more than 80 participants, and yet here we are at a gathering of almost 250 attendees in an online community of people who are similarly interested in the emerging field of illustration studies. Thank you for joining us for this online experiment. I can't wait to hear our panelists' perspectives and your observations. Building upon a Rockwell Center symposium organized last year in collaboration with the D.B. Dowd Modern Graphic History Library at Washington University in St. Louis, and with our fellows Douglas Dowd, Michelle Bogart, Erica Das, and Christopher Lukasik, this program brings together scholars, curators, and artists who are exploring new approaches to the study of illustration within historical and contemporary frameworks. As a set of practices and a cultural force, thanks to advancements in imagery production and high-speed printing, illustration emerged in the 19th century as a new and distinctly modern phenomenon. A vital component of the visual language of advertising, design, publishing, and entertainment, illustration is omnipresent in modern culture, yet its historical and theoretical specifics have remained relatively unexamined. The good news is that in this field, there is much exciting work to do. Today's program will cover much ground, starting with the theme of immigration and migration in illustrating, a subject closely aligned to the Norman Rockwell Museum's recent exhibition, Finding Home: 4 Artist Journeys, which feature the art of illustrators Francis Jeter, James McMullen, David Macaulay, and Juji Morales. A panel of curators will discuss the rich institutional collections that serve as a resource for scholars in the field, and 2 lightning rounds will showcase the work of inspired graduate students focused on published imagery in the 19th and 20th centuries. Before I introduce my colleague and collaborator, I would just like to take a moment to thank a few individuals who have helped us to make this program possible. First and foremost, much appreciation goes to Michael Lobel, Professor of Art History at Hunter College and the Graduate Center, Cuny, whose inspired vision helped to shape every aspect of this program. We are most thankful for his exceptional work and for his time and dedication to the cause. Thanks also to Howard Singerman, Chair of the Department of Art and Art History, for his generosity and support. We are most grateful to Richard and Mary Kelly Family Fund for their sponsorship of this program. Richard is a trustee of the Norman Rockwell Museum and a generous art donor. Some of you may be aware of the exceptional Kelly collection of American illustration, which sets the standard for the Golden Age. My appreciation goes to Director, CEO Lori Norton Moffett and the staff and board of the Norman Rockwell Museum for their ongoing belief in the importance of enhancing scholarship relating to illustration art across disciplines, and to my colleagues Jana Purdy and Rich Bradway, who were integral to the many organizational aspects of today's program. Their enthusiasm and support has been invaluable, and this wonderful day would not have been possible without them. Many thanks to each of our panelists for sharing the fascinating directions that their interests and research has taken them, and we appreciate all of you for making time to join us today. You are participating from as near to us as the Berkshires of Massachusetts and to states across the nation and several countries around the world. So happy you are with us. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Michael Lobel, Professor of Art History at Hunter College and the Graduate Center, Cuny. His publications include Image Duplicator, Roy Lichtenstein and the Emergence of Pop Art, James Rosenquist, Pop Art, Politics, and History in the 1960s, and John Sloan, Drawing on Illustration, which was awarded the Smithsonian American Art Museum's Charles C. Eldredge Prize for Distinguished Scholarship in American Art. His research has been supported by grants and fellowships from the Henry Luce Foundation, American Council of Learned Societies, the Rockwell Center for American Visual Studies as our first fellow, and the Getty Research Institute. During the 2021 academic year, he will be the Terra Foundation for American Art visiting professor at the University of Oxford. Thank you all for joining us again. We look forward to the program.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. So I'm hoping everyone can hear me. Okay. Thank you all so much for joining us today, particularly given current challenging circumstances. I want to begin by extending my deepest thanks to the staff of the Norman Rockwell Museum, particularly Stephanie Plunkett, Jenna Purdy, and Rich Bradway, who've all worked tirelessly not only to plan this event, but also to move it online at incredibly short notice. To the faculty and staff of the Hunter College Department of Art and Art History, especially Department Chair Howard Singerman, to all of our speakers who have been so flexible and amenable in moving their presentations online, and to all of you joining us today. I'm so thrilled that we've been able to have so many people and really offer this opportunity to people around the world. I want to note as well, and Stephanie mentioned this, that much of the impetus behind this event was to continue building on the important work done at a 3-day conference on illustration held last spring at Washington University in St. Louis. What that conference demonstrated for me is that there's a large and growing group of practicing illustrators, curators, archivists, art historians, scholars of visual culture, and the like, who are engaging with illustration right now as an important and serious subject of scholarly study. Considering our current circumstances, I had a lot of ideas about how to start things off today. For instance, I thought I could begin with the visual correlation between the traditional multi-panel comic strip and the suddenly ubiquitous layout of the Zoom screen, which is obviously how we're reaching you today, and which has already inspired its own art historical means. In as much as illustration is an art form deeply connected to current events, I also thought of a wide range of images to lead with, from editorial cartoons commenting on the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic to scathing political critiques of the type we'll be seeing shortly from our panelist, Idel Rodriguez. But what I kept coming back to were 2 illustrations, one of which I'll get to shortly, and the other an image that appeared in the humor magazine Life in 1905. For the magazine, this was a notable event. Charles Dana Gibson, probably the most renowned and successful American illustrator of the day, excuse me, and a regular contributor to the publication, had announced that he was turning away from his lucrative career and sailing to Europe to dedicate himself to painting. Having reached a point of financial security, he now yearned to remake himself as a fine artist. The magazine marked his departure with this memorable cut and paste job I'm showing you now, in which a throng of his characters have been assembled to bid adieu to their creator, who waves to them from the stern of a ship. Gibson's journey was not just a transatlantic one. He was departing the realm of illustration to test his mettle in the land of painting. Those figures on the dock represent his creations at the same time they stand for the medium that Gibson was leaving behind. Now, this is a resonant image in part because its mass of huddled figures and that cruise ship on the right hold such different meanings to us right now. It also touches on the theme of immigration and migration in illustrating that our first group of panelists will address. But this image is also significant to me because it frames something of the reverse of, or at least a contrast to my own experience. If Gibson's transit between illustrating and fine art was a thoroughly self-determined one, I have to admit that mine has been more of an accidental voyage. Unlike some of you assembled here today, here online, I can't really claim to be primarily a scholar of illustration studies. Rather, I came in through a much more roundabout route when I realized in the midst of writing about the early 20th century American artist John Sloan, that what I was really thinking through was the relationship in Sloan's work, as in that of others, between illustrating and fine art. And on the right, 2 panels from a series of word puzzles that Sloan produced regularly in the first decade or so of the 20th century. In the years since I began exploring this terrain, I've been routinely surprised by just how many figures in the field of modern art were deeply invested in illustrating, and in fact thought at some point in their careers that they would be professional illustrators before turning to other pursuits. And what I've also come to recognize, and part of my inclination, my impetus for joining here today and really doing all this work with Stephanie and Jana and Rich and the staff of the Rockwell Museum, what I've come to realize is that even the most studied art historians, how few of them are either aware of or fully willing to recognize the implications of this deep interconnection between illustration and fine art. And let me just say that I'm not only thinking about more obvious examples like Toulouse-Lautrec or Andy Warhol, to cite yet another example, that veritable hero, or in some people's eyes, anti-hero of modern art, none other than Marcel Duchamp, developer of the radical modern notion of the ready-made, had a long stretch of time in his early career in which he devoted himself to illustrating, producing a good body of drawings largely meant for French humor magazines of the time. Similarly, in the past few years, I've spent considerable time studying a Dutch artist who, in the late 19th century, became fascinated by contemporary social realist illustrators during his time in London, a preoccupation which followed him into his earliest years as a developing artist. I'm speaking, of course, of Vincent van Gogh, who not only based a good swath of his early work on drawings from the illustrated press, but also amassed a collection of around 2,000 popular wood engravings. And just one of the many, many initiatives focused around illustration and popular imagery that's going on today, the Van Gogh Museum has been, in recent years, inventorying and cataloging this more than 1,800 group of wood engravings collected by Van Gogh himself. Now, while this is something that pertains to modern art more broadly, it is particularly true of artists in the United States. Indeed, in a lecture several years ago, I proposed that we might envision what I called a century of illustration, by which I meant a delimited historical period in which illustration helped define the course of art in the United States. And while things don't usually shake out quite so conveniently from a historical perspective, there's some room to argue that this period lasted exactly 100 years. To my mind, it would commence in 1861 with Winslow Homer's first Civil War illustrations for Harper's Weekly, and it would end in 1961 with a window display designed by Andy Warhol for the Bonwit Teller department store in New York City. Behind a row of mannequins displaying the season's fashions, Warhol set a group of his recent canvases in a nascent pop art style, all of which used images from printed illustrations. This window that I'm showing you below marks a moment then in which popular printed imagery was being absorbed into the practice of painting as never before. Now, I'll be honest to all of you out there. At the time, this idea of a century of illustration wasn't much more than a notion I included in a lecture in the spirit of trying out a new idea. I didn't really think it would stick, actually, but I've been pleasantly surprised as time has gone on that I'm not less, but rather more convinced of its validity. Maybe not of these exact historical parameters, but at least of their general outlines. And what I've found is that the more I've looked, the more I've come across telling and illuminating examples of this phenomenon. So for instance, I'm currently very interested in how this is true of a relatively sizable group of African-American artists. Up until very recently, I had no idea that Henry Osawa Tanner, who is best known for his paintings of the 1890s, like The Banjo Lesson, which I'm showing you here, and The Thankful Poor, was a full decade earlier supporting himself supplying illustrations for such publications as the weekly magazine, Our Continent, and that's what I'm showing you on the left. And then there's Harlem Renaissance artist Aaron Douglas. Art historians today tend to pay the lion's share of attention to Douglas's paintings and mural works like Aspiration of 1936, included in the Whitney Museum's current Vita Americana exhibition. But an argument could be made, and I think it would be a correct one, that Douglas's imagery was much more impactful and certainly more widely circulated in his own time in his multifarious illustrations, through which he became the premier visual stylist of the Harlem Renaissance. And then there is Charles Alston, who is known as a painter who worked in both abstraction and figuration, as in The Family from 1955 in the Whitney Museum collection. But this framing of his career as a painter who worked back and forth between abstraction and figuration overlooks the fact that Alston spent much of the 1930s and 1940s as a successful illustrator who produced covers for such major magazines as Fortune, Collier's, and The New Yorker, who designed album covers for the likes of Duke Ellington, and who some reports suggest earn upwards of $25,000 a year as a commercial artist, not an insignificant sum. In preparing for today, I found myself drawn more and more to this New Yorker cover by Alston that I'm showing you on the left. Perhaps it's that its subject comes so close to that of a major picture by another Harlem Renaissance artist that I just studied with my American art class at Hunter College. Palmer Hayden's The Janitor Who Paints, of the same period, which similarly depicts a laborer's aspirations toward more creative pursuits. My students and I discussed how that dilemma, this tension between being framed and cast as a laborer, and this is something that's analyzed at length in an important essay by the art historian John Ott, is in tension with the creative pursuits and the artistic persona that these artists were developing. My students and I discussed how that dilemma was faced by many African artists at the time. But it's also, I think, that I've come to see Alston's illustration as richly metaphorical. It obviously relates to our current situation with its image of a group activity reduced to a lone, isolated figure. And that depiction of an abandoned stage might equally have resonated in the Depression era as in our own moment, when the health of so many cultural organizations is threatened by economic instability. And I find myself drawn as well to the image's graphic impact, particularly that of those stylized music stands that are sprinkled throughout the stage, which function as abstract window frame-like geometric shapes as much as the real world objects they are meant to denote. However we interpret this cover drawing by Alston, in the end, it underscores just how much more a serious consideration of illustrating may promise to teach us, a goal that today's proceedings are intended to further fulfill.